Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Golan. I'm executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and we are here for another episode of Life, the Universe, and Humanistic Judaism. And this is our series where we hear from clergy within Humanistic Judaism on whatever the heck they want to talk about. It's always very interesting and informative and educational, and it has been very diverse and eclectic as far as what the topics have been. So we're thrilled that you're all joining us. Again, this is a program just for members of SHJ, either directly as independent members or for members of our affiliated local communities throughout the US and Canada. And it's a thank you for supporting Humanistic Judaism through your membership. It is something that we try to emphasize, that really membership is tzedakah, it's charitable giving. We're all nonprofit organizations, both SHJ and our local affiliated communities. So we need your support. And it is an opportunity for us to say thanks, to give back a little bit. Of course, these programs are then put on YouTube afterwards for everyone to watch. So we try not to restrict too much only to members, but it's an opportunity to be part of the conversation that you wouldn't get if you're watching afterwards on YouTube. So thank you all so much for being here. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Rabbi Jodi Kornfeld. She is the founder and rabbi of Beth Chaverim Humanistic Jewish Community in Deerfield, Illinois. Uh, Jodi was ordained by the ISHJ in 2009 and holds a master's degree in Jewish studies and a doctor of science in Jewish studies, both from Spertus College in Chicago. She's past president of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis and co-editor of the new book, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, Beliefs, Values, Practices, published by the Jewish Publication Society. And I don't know if you saw it, Jodi, but I actually got a printed catalog in the mail like less than a month ago from Jewish Publication Society, and you guys were right on the back cover with like 3 other books. It was very exciting to see and wonderful representation for our movement. So thanks for putting that, helping to put that together, and welcome. Oh, there you have it. It's tagged and everything. So I'm gonna remove my spotlight and let you take it away. And then if folks have questions, you want to let them put it in the chat or hang on to it, and then afterwards you
Yes.
can begin to address it. Great. So
Mhm.
I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for the welcome, for the invitation. Thank you to old friends who I see who have joined, and I appreciate that, and to friends that I haven't yet met in person. I'm really so glad that you've all elected to spend some time with me together as we celebrate Jewish Women's History Month, the month of March, and it coincides more generally with Women's History Month. Women in the Bible is an important subject for humanistic Jews. And that's so because although we rightly and often profess to read the Bible as literature, I fear that too often we might shy away from traditional texts simply because they're traditional. And we may have, the images in our mind of how we learned some of these texts to begin with. Back
Okay,
when.
sisters. So tomorrow night.
Sorry? Are we okay? Okay. So as I was saying, I think that we make a mistake if we fail to tackle the texts. And in our book, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, we include an essay by Rabbi Daniel Friedman entitled Recovering Our Stories. And in it, it describes the need for cultural literacy and retaining our stories because, as he says, they offer, quote, a rich metaphorical vocabulary that makes possible what rational philosophic discourse cannot: the dramatic display of human emotions, values, and dilemmas in time-honored scenarios featuring, compelling characters. So that broadly applies to the entire biblical text, and perhaps even more so where women in the Bible are concerned. I often say when I'm dealing with the biblical text that there are so many ways to shuffle the deck, depending on what theme we want to highlight, what theme we're looking for, new things can appear that may have been overlooked. And I think that that's especially true when we consider women in the Bible. It's such a broad and a rich subject that our time together really will only scratch the surface. And I'm hoping that your curiosity will be piqued, that you may say to yourself, you know, I knew about some of these characters, but I didn't realize that there might have been that many of them. Any one of these women or themes could take up an entire academic course. And when I've taught biblical texts as part of our adult ed, we have gone on for a series of months on women in the Bible. I did a presentation for SHJ on the book of Ruth, just simply those characters. So it's a very rich, fertile area to be able to look up more. Now, we need to start with a few basic premises, I suppose, because while I'm touting women in the Bible and, oh, there are so many and all of this, we can't ignore the fact that the Bible is a patriarchal text. Only 1.1% of words spoken in both the Old and the New Testament were spoken by women. And just under 8% of the named characters in the Hebrew Bible are women. Only 111 out of 1,426. So otherwise, if they're not named, we still know that there are women. So we have, for instance, they are someone's wife. We know of Lot's wife, Job's wife. Those are women who don't have names, they just have a status. We know of people who are referred to as someone's daughter. For instance, Jephthah's daughter in an absolutely horrific story in Judges 11. We know that the woman that was created in Genesis doesn't become Eve until she leaves the Garden of Eden. Otherwise, she is just the woman. And though reading the Bible as literature allows new interpretations, we need to always be careful that we don't retroject our own values back in time and assume that they were values of that ancient time. So with those two minuscule percentages that I told you about spoken words and names, it raises the question, can feminism even be found there? Or is that a modern construct that has no real place in the text? I suggest, though, that even though feminism as a term would be a foreign concept, there are female characters who engage in the heroic, the courageous, and can be considered worthy of emulation and perhaps even being role models. In other words, when we look for women in the Bible, we definitely can find them. So there are several ways of approaching this topic, ways to categorize women's plot lines. First, I think that we can examine the notion of insiders and outsiders. The paradigm is meant to distinguish women who are generally thought to be important in our tradition, and they could be considered insiders. I think that the big four, the four matriarchs, right? Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel. Those are women who I think we could all agree, those are insiders. They have a role to play. They've been elected by our tradition to be the matriarchs. And so they would be insiders. We also, though, have outsiders. And these are lesser known women who are interesting, but our tradition has cast them out either literally or by assigning them a prohibited status, and therefore they can be seen as outsiders. So this would include Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden with whom Abraham had a child, Ishmael, and who the text says was literally cast out into the wilderness. Her name, Hagar, means the stranger. There's also somebody else that occupies sort of this prohibited status, and that is the witch of Endor. And she is a woman that Saul consults in the book of Samuel to conjure up the ghost of Samuel. Now, I happen to really like, she doesn't have a big role to play, but I like the witch of Endor, and I will show you why. Okay. This is from Bewitched. We have Endora, who is Samantha's mother. And So the Witch of Endor really is the cultural allusion for Andorra in that 1960s television show. And so, and Paul and I were talking a little bit before we got started, and I said I had a surprise for him, knowing his love of pop culture, that it reminds me, having this doll reminds me of that biblical passage. Bewitched was a television show that was created by a man named Saul Sachs, and he was born to Jewish immigrant parents. He's the one who wrote the pilot in which Andorra was introduced. He didn't stick with the show, but he wrote the pilot. And when I happened to buy this, just as an aside, a total aside, I got it at the flea market, which I enjoy spending time at every Sunday during the summer. And I asked the price of it, and I explained, I bought something from this man before, and I had explained that I always look for Jewish action figures, and that this reminds me of the passage in Samuel about the Witch of Endor. Well, he just thought, for the story, he reduced the price because he said, you've given me the story. And so the Witch of Endor is part of my personal collection. So these are women, you have to understand the Witch of Endor, when Saul goes to consult her, the biblical text is full of, you don't go to conjurers and diviners and engage in any kind of magic. And yet here he is going to her. There's also sort of a hybrid category, and those are people who are sort of both insider and outsider. This would include Atalia, and she's mentioned in 2 Kings in chapter 11. She was both a queen of Judah, ruling for 6 years, and she was despised. So during the time that she was the queen, we are told by the biblical writer that the land was tranquil. And by that, it means that there was no war. But she was despised because the biblical writer tells us that the high priest conspired to have her killed. When? On a Shabbat, no less. And once this was done, she was to be taken through the horse's gate. How many more ways can the biblical writer let us know that she is not to be emulated? Atalia was Jezebel's daughter, but which is from the north. Jezebel was a queen in the north during the Omride dynasty. And she was also, though, a Yahwist, which was the biblical god of the time. And we know that because her name ends with Yah. Anytime you see a biblical name that ends with that, it's indicating loyalty to Yahweh, to the biblical God. So she was the only queen of Judah. So we know that there was a status of queen in and of her own right, but she wasn't part of the Davidic dynasty. Instead, she was seen as a disruption to it. And so she comes to this absolutely horrible end. She didn't exactly conduct herself in the best way in becoming the queen. We're not going to put her on par with another queen that we know of, and we'll talk about a little bit, is Queen Esther. But Atalia is an important person to understand if we're looking at women in the Bible. The retelling of her story clearly reflects the priestly agenda. And as far as we know, there were no female priests, no priestesses. We don't have reference to that kind of a status. There are texts, though, that tell us about other statuses of women or concerns of the population, and that those are thematically likely to be women's stories. And being women's stories, they probably, because we started with an oral tradition, they probably were considered too important to just write the characters out, to just erase them entirely. That it was better from the agenda of the biblical writer to include them rather than exclude them. It should be noted almost without saying that there were women in the ancient world. When we say it's a patriarchal document, sometimes we might forget that. And especially given the low percentage of women who speak or the low percentage of women with names. Nonetheless, women would have been a sizable, perhaps up to half of the population in the ancient world. So from these different statuses, we learn, for instance, of 3 women in particular who had the status of being a prophetess, a Naviah, and those are Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah. And it was Huldah that was called upon to authenticate the book of teaching, which is thought to be the book of Deuteronomy. And so she's called upon after King Josiah finds this book of teaching. You may say to yourself, well, why doesn't this job go to a man? It doesn't explain it, but she's the one who's called in. So from that, we learn that at least some women would have been literate. They would have been able to read, because without being able to read that book of teaching, Huldah couldn't authenticate it. There's also the extraordinarily industrious but unnamed woman of valor who's described in Proverbs 21. You know, I think of that song, you know, that she brings home the bacon, she fries it, she cooks it, she eats it, right? That whole line. She's up at dawn. She visits the men at the gates. She takes care of her children. She takes care of her husband. She makes sure that there's food on the table, etc. My beloved biblical teacher, Rachel Doolin at Spertus, she always thought that the woman of valor story in Proverbs 31 was satire, but that's clearly a female point of view on that one. We're informed that Deborah, not only being a prophetess, she was a judge. People brought their disputes to her under this palm. You can almost, you know, imagine what that must have looked like. That was sort of her outdoor courtroom, if you will. And she would make decisions that people would abide by. So her authority extended not only to making the decisions, but being respected in what those decisions were. The Bible lets us know about queens and queen mothers. Bathsheba, she's the queen based on her marriage to David, and she's the queen mother because she's the mother of Solomon, and Solomon is the one who succeeds David as king. We know of Jezebel. As I said, she was a queen in the north in the Omride dynasty, and she's the queen mother of Italia, as mentioned. And speaking of Italia, we have then the queen in Judah. There are spaces in the biblical text that women or the feminine particularly occupy. And these are unique spaces in the biblical text. For example, wisdom. The Hebrew word for wisdom is chokhmah. That is a feminine biblical word. And wisdom is personified as a woman. And it says in Proverbs 8, I was there when the world was created. So we don't call her a goddess. The Jewish tradition is not to construe a duality where there was the biblical God and a biblical goddess, but wisdom, this female presence was there. And she's rather frank in Proverbs 8, in indicating what she saw and what she knew and why wisdom was so important. The Bible also divides the power to name. Women, generally speaking, have the power to name people. Men named places. Now, there are some exceptions, and I'm not going to sort of go down that rabbit hole right now, but the power to name was really important when you're naming people. Lot's daughter, otherwise without a name herself, she named her son Moab. The community of women in the book of Ruth, they are the ones who name Ruth and Naomi's son Obed. Eve, when she is left by implication in Genesis 4, she names Cain and Seth. Leah names her own children, and Rachel names Jacob's children with his concubine Bilhah. Leah names Jacob's children with the other concubine Zilpah, and Rachel names her own son Joseph. So this power of naming, it's an extraordinary power. When I do naming ceremonies and we talk about conferring names, that a person's name, I say during a ceremony, it's that person's strength. It's where they have come from, what their parents hope they will be. And so giving that power to women is kind of an extraordinary power to have and to be able to vest in women. There's an institution in the Bible known as the Beit Em, the mother's house, and that's mentioned 4 times. Again, the Bible tends to be really spare and sparse in its words. So when something is repeated more than once, it should make us perhaps sit up and take notice. So the Beit Em is mentioned once in Genesis in the Rebecca narrative, twice in the book Song of Songs, and once in the book of Ruth. Now, it's thought to be a place where young girls were educated in the ways of the world, and also where boys were being raised. And even though it was part of the compound known as the Beit Av, the father's house, it nonetheless was separate. The biblical archaeologist Carol Myers identifies 6 fundamental characteristics of a Beit Em. She says, these are the 6. A woman's story is being told. A wisdom association is present. So already we have this idea, Chokhmah is showing up in these things, and it's a woman's story. Women are agents in their own destiny. The agency of women affects others. The setting is domestic, and generally speaking, marriage is involved. So the Beit Em, when we come across that phrase. Before we proceed to take a quick look at the importance of women in our holidays and the biblical roots of some of that, there are 2 stories about women that might not be as widely known, but I think really merit mention. We have in the book of Numbers the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. Now, before we get all carried away that they're only daughters and they're only named as his daughters, let's pause. There are 5 of them. They all have names. There's Mala, Noah, Nogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. Zelophehad was from the tribe of Manasseh, which divided Joseph's section because it was his son. And according to the story, he only had daughters. He had no sons. Now, if the biblical writer wanted to make a point, 1 daughter would have been able to make the point. We didn't need 5 of them, but there are 5. And of the 5, 3 are actually place names in ancient Israel: Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. So given that paucity of women with names, the fact that there are 5 all grouped into one story makes that a kind of a significant story. They were seeking to inherit what their father had that otherwise would go to sons, because the daughters at that time weren't in a position to inherit. So the daughters petitioned Moses, and it's a little bit above his pay grade, so he in turn asked the biblical God, like, how am I supposed to decide this? But in reading the story, we almost forget it's a desert story. It's taking place during the book of Numbers, which is in the wilderness. So what exactly was there to own? And what exactly was there to inherit? Clearly, I think as we know, but again, it's worth underscoring, the biblical text is not a history book. It was not written chronologically. So it likely was something written after the establishment of community in a settled way. And anytime the biblical writer could throw things back in time to the time of Moses, that was thought to give that text a little bit more authority. Okay, so their petition is granted, and the modern reader, especially women, go, "Yay! It's a great victory for women's rights. We're thrilled. We're great. They get to inherit too." Then we get to Numbers 36. And that right to inherit was limited. And what happened? The daughters were required to marry within the clan in order to get that portion and keep the property within it as belonging to their husbands. So what we learned from this is, yes, they get to inherit, but it's the preservation of their father's name. His name being associated with a land possession, that's what's being preserved. It's an important story, though, because it involved 5 named women. So even though their rights end up limited, it suggests that it was not unheard of for this petition to be made and this petition to be honored. Secondly, there's a story in the book of Judges about a woman named Achsah, and she was Caleb's daughter. Now, whether or not you remember the story of the spies, where Caleb is one of 13 spies who are sent to the land. He and Joshua come back and report it's a land of milk and honey, and the other spies are like, oh no, the people are they're giants and makes us feel like we're caterpillars. But Caleb and Joshua are the ones who are rewarded for reporting that the land is in fact a good one. Caleb wants to give his daughter in marriage to a man named Othniel. He's a Kenizzite, and he had attacked and captured a particular city. So Achsah, we are told, dismounts from her donkey. Okay, and I underscore that point just to show that she's independent in the sense that she's riding her own animal vehicle. She's riding her own donkey. She's not being carried along or, trailing along. And what does she do? She asks her father for springs of water. This request is granted. Now, why would I bother to spotlight Achsah in it? Because it is a woman who is recognizing that a land without water is worthless and that water is a precious resource. We have that idea coming back again when Miriam, when she dies in the book of Numbers, it said that there was no water that could be found, no wells of water could be found. By implication, it suggested in our tradition that as long as Miriam was with the people as they were wandering, a well of water would spring up, water being life-giving. And if we want to extend the metaphor even further, that the women were life-giving. Okay. So we could also add the theme of birth and birthing. There's a story of Rahab who is protecting the Israelites as the enemy is coming forward, and she's afraid she's going to get turned in. She's an innkeeper, but sometimes she was described as a prostitute because it depended what you were going to do with the Hebrew. She was an innkeeper. And so she ends up with this thread, this rope that she lets the Israelites down, the people who are there, and therefore lets them escape. Metaphorically, we can view that rope to be like an umbilical cord as she is keeping the birthing process going. We have stories of rape and incest with the story of Dinah and the story of Tamar. There are actually 3 Tamars in the Bible. But I want to spend a bit of time and then have time for questions about the importance of women in holidays. So the Passover Haggadah traditionally doesn't even include the name of Moses. And the ancient rabbis, when they put the Haggadah together, they didn't want all of these miraculous things and the freedom and the redemption from slavery to be attributed to a human being. Instead, they wanted it attributed to the biblical God. So Moses isn't even mentioned in a traditional Haggadah. Yet, he is considered by our tradition to be the greatest prophet. Now, if we take a look at Exodus 1 and 2, it makes it clear that Moses isn't exactly the moral example that we might hope for, but instead in Exodus 1 and 2, it's women who are the moral examples. I don't think it's going too far to say that there might not even be a story of Moses if there were not the actions of 5 women. So what we have named, again, naming is so important. We have named midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. They do not obey the Pharaoh's edict to kill all the male Hebrew babies. Secondly, unnamed at this point, though later on we understand it to be Miriam, who is Moses's older sister. She follows Moses along as he's sent down the river in a basket as part of his mother's efforts to save him. And at this point, again, we don't have his mother's name. We will learn later that her name is Yocheved. We have the unnamed Pharaoh's daughter. She's referred to as Bat Paro, daughter of Pharaoh, or Batya. And she pulls this baby from the river. Now, again, if we stop and pause, and we're going to analyze and do our careful critical reading of it, the only reason that there would be a baby floating in a basket down the river is because it's a Hebrew baby. Yet she saves him, and she's going to raise him as his own. And again, the unnamed sister, Miriam, she goes to the daughter, Pharaoh's daughter, and she says, do you need a wet nurse? And Pharaoh's daughter says, yes, and I will pay her wages for this. And so what does Miriam do? Ever the resourceful big sister, she goes and enlists her own mother to become the wet nurse for what truly is her own son. So the holiday of Passover has these women who really play an important part in kind of launching the story. The holiday of Purim that we just celebrated is contained in the book of Esther. It's one of two books named for women, the book of Esther and the book of Ruth. Now, the book of Esther is really loved by humanistic Jews because nowhere does it mention the biblical God. Everything that's achieved is achieved through human actions, and we don't have to sort of play games with, oh, even God is hidden in there. You know, we can read it on its own terms. And though Esther is the heroine of the Purim story, there's another woman who really has the status of outsider, and her name is Vashti. Vashti was the king's first wife, and she was banished, perhaps executed, when she refused to dance naked at the king's banquet. The text says she was asked to dance with her crown on, but the tradition has interpreted it to mean she was asked to dance wearing only her crown. So Vashti is an important figure, though not widely known and not widely celebrated. Then the book of Ruth is traditionally read at Shavuot. That was originally an agricultural holiday. As we create new rituals, we can again look at the text involving women. For example, the newer ritual object of a Miriam's cup that some people place on their Seder table as sort of the counterbalance to Elijah's cup. But that cup, Miriam's cup, Kos Miriam, is filled with water. And it's filled with water, again, from that midrashic notion that when Miriam died, they didn't have any more water. And as long as Miriam was with them. It's also meant to suggest and honor all the Jewish women in our tradition, particularly at the time of Passover, when we're talking about freedom and liberation. And then the holiday of Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Chodesh is considered, that's the first of the month. And that is considered a women's holiday because it was a reward for women who did not take part in the story of the golden calf. They did not turn in their jewelry to be melted down to create the golden calf. And as a result, they were rewarded by being exempt from certain kinds of work. In our own time, Rosh Chodesh celebrations of women's role in our tradition, of taking care of ourselves, of what it is that we give and how we nurture. These have become broader themes for women and for girls as we can celebrate Rosh Chodesh. So these are some of the ways that I hope maybe you've learned something, maybe you've learned of some women that you didn't know before. Because it is, as I said, it is a topic that I could go on, and I really did try to moderate. It's also a topic that when I've taught a seminar I taught one last year for rabbinic students, the topic was, the presentation was 3 hours. So I know that I was talking kind of quickly and giving you really a lot of information, but I really enjoy celebrating Jewish Women's History Month in this way.
Well, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and there's a lot to unpack. I was particularly struck right from the get-go with the statistics about how few women have speaking roles, how few women are named. It reminded me, have you heard of the Bechdel test for movies? This is, have folks heard of this? It is a measure, I'm reading this from Wikipedia, a measure of the representation of women in film and other fiction. The test asks whether a work features at least 2 women who have a conversation about something other than a man. And using that measurement, there's like almost no films, like it's very rare to find any film that has that. So I immediately thought of that test and the statistics that you kind of presented. Obviously, the Bible would pretty much fail that test in every story almost. But then you gave some great examples of women that are extremely relevant and important, and certainly many of whom we've all heard before. So it makes the contrast with the percentage that much more shocking, because it does seem like we know biblical women, but the representation is so low. So thank you. That was fascinating.
You're welcome.
And I do not have the Bewitched Migo. The company that makes that is Migo, but I do have the I Dream of Jeannie set, which was the other 1960s magical woman hiding her powers TV show sitcom. I don't know why I bought that one and not the one that you have, but anyway, that was nice to see. So thank you for that.
You're definitely welcome. And if I turn my screen just a little bit, on that top shelf over there are my Jewish women, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Barbara Streisand and so on. And then this way, because someone mentioned the Pee Wee Herman, over to the other side, top shelf are my Jewish comedians.
Okay.
Yeah,
awesome.
you know, it's often hard when you're at a flea market or whatever and you want to explain, yeah, I'm a Jewish educator, and so I'm looking for only the Jewish action figures. I'm at the flea market. I'm really not looking for the value on eBay. I'm really confirming that Don Adams was Jewish because I want to buy his Get Smart figure. So there you go.
There you go. Yeah, and I was trying to think of, was there a Jewish angle on I Dream of Jeannie, and I don't think so, but I'm sure producers or directors certainly, but I don't think any of the actors were. But anyway, so we'll take some questions. I see Rick has his hand up first. So Rick, do you want to ask something?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jodi. The Jewish community, including the Orthodox, has been sort of mining the gender empowerment of the Bible for a few decades now. And, you know, the Orthodox have, you know, trying to find ways of reinvigorating the Orthodox tradition. I'm sure that other movements of Judaism are doing the same. But what do you envision for humanistic Judaism? What lessons can we learn, and how can it affect the way that we empower women and change perhaps our approach to life?
That's a really interesting question, because we start out with a movement that's egalitarian, that always has been egalitarian, that has ordained women, you know, from the get-go. We didn't have to wait until 1972, like the Reform movement, or even worse, 1985, like the conservative movement, which had been in existence for so long before they finally ordained a woman. I think that what we can learn and how we go forward is that we treat all of our ceremonies in an egalitarian way. We don't privilege girls over boys by doing a bar mitzvah for a girl at 12, even though rabbinic texts suggest that they reach the age of maturity before a boy, and that's why you got to age 12 instead of 13. I think that coming back to what Rabbi Friedman said in his essay, that by being able to reclaim our stories, they can, our stories can act as inspiration for not only boys and girls, but particularly for girls. There's a lot of talk as, I want to thread this needle carefully and not go down, get diverted by politics. But a lot of people are saying that when they see someone that looks like them, it's an inspiration for them to go on to become whatever them are. Ignore the horrible grammar of that sentence, okay? So that when somebody, a young girl, for instance, were to see that there is a woman who's a rabbi, they now know they too can be a rabbi. Okay, I grew up in the conservative movement. I did not see women as rabbis at all. My bat mitzvah was on a Friday night because girls were not permitted to read from the Torah on a Saturday. So all of those kinds of shifts, I think, become, we really set the example. We really set the example. And I'm really hoping that as our movement gets more known, which is also a strange thing to say after all of these decades, but as we become more known, that and how we approach biblical text, people will say, you know what, that resonates with me. I'm not being excluded from that text. I can take a look at, oh, Women's History Month Purim falls during March. That's wonderful. Let's have those two things dovetail and put an emphasis on that. Let's make sure that when we retell the story of Passover, whether it's in a previously written Haggadah or people are writing their own, we say their names, Shifra and Pua, right? These are the first examples that we have of civil disobedience. So I think that when we underscore that, when we are not reading text in a way that overlooks things because we want to get to the big, narrative climax, but instead we slow it down and we say, oh, look, here's somebody that's worth paying attention to. I think that's where our movement can really fill in a way that other movements perhaps, I don't want to say that they don't, but they've been slower.
Review?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. What I wanted to ask was in regards to the woman in the Exodus story. I heard, although through traditional lens, that the woman did not participate in the building of the golden calf because they were vainous. They had a lot of vanity towards their jewelry. And they said, who are you to force us to give the only thing that we treasure as an object in this world in order to just satisfy your goals? I'm not sure if that's a very good interpretation, but I heard it nevertheless.
So that's not one that I've heard. I would very respectfully suggest that is a very patriarchal way of looking at women and what they did. And if they only did it out of vanity, then it doesn't explain why they would have been rewarded for not creating this idol. In other words, if that's the rationale, then the subsequent consequences don't match. It doesn't hold up. Women are specifically excluded from certain categories of work, and that's where this idea of Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and we could go on about the whole Rosh Chodesh celebrations, that it's based on the moon, and women's menstrual cycles are based on the moon, and so there was already sort of a good merger, if you will, between women and Rosh Chodesh. But I think that if it were simply vanity that kept women from doing it, that they would not have been rewarded by the exemption, the work exemptions. But that's interesting. I've not heard that before.
Well, I come from a very Orthodox community. I'm not following it, of course, but yeah.
No, I
No,
understand.
the way they understood it was, well, they did the right thing for the wrong reason, so they still reserve the reward.
So, again,
It
I,
sounds
I,
horrifying.
I think that that is a very male explanation of women's actions. That sometimes that we kind of backed into doing the right thing. Oh, silly women. But
Yeah. At the same time, I wish that in
yeah, no, I get it.
communities,
I get it. Thank you.
I wish, for example, in the communities in here, I'm in Europe, and most of the communities that I know are Orthodox, and I'm not sure when they will ever permit a woman to be a rabbi, and I feel very bad for that.
Sure.
What do we have other questions? We have a couple more minutes. Someone want to put their hand up or just unmute if they can't find that feature of Zoom and ask a question? So who's your favorite person or woman in the Bible?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I love Rebecca.
Why?
Her story is filled with action verbs. She goes, she gets, she's and so it's filled with action verbs, and she is able to make her own decision. So it starts out where Abraham's servant Eliezer, his mission is to go back to the land where Abraham was from to find a wife for Isaac. And he says he sees her at the well, and she offers to give him water and her camels. So we get this notion of kindness to animals derives from that biblical passage. And he says, whose daughter are you? And she explains who she is without ever telling her name. And then he starts to negotiate with her father Betuel and her brother Laban, and they say, Kach v'lech, take her and go. And her mother is a little bit like, not so fast. And she goes to the Beit Em. And they said, give her 10 days and let's see what she's going to decide. And then they ask her, will you go? And she says, yes, I will. So that difference between take her and go, will you go with him? Yes, I will, is quite a remarkable transition in that story arc. And then she receives a blessing from this chorus of women, if you will. And that the blessing that she receives parallels the blessing that Abraham is given earlier in Genesis. And so to me, the story of Rebecca, I find really fascinating for that part.
Great. A lot of appreciation in the chat. Does anyone have other questions? I mean, there's a lot really to unpack about attitudes toward women, and you touch on it. And to me, what's really sadly still relevant is the way it is, even to today, weaponized by the far right in terms of how society should be structured as like a source, right? And the way you explain it, certainly about the representation, but even on things that I think some in the Jewish community point to as a thing of pride, like that women could own property, you kind of articulated, well, you know, there were strings attached and so on. So is there source material or like the agency that certain biblical women have that we can say our ancestors were ahead of the curve, or did it really just like keep us in a bad place for 2,000 years? Like, what do you think it's overall positive, negative? You can't pick a yeah.
I never want to, oversell the All right, I don't want to oversell the notion of feminism in the Bible.
Right.
Because I'm not sure that that's as I said, that's not a term that they would ever have recognized. Instead, what I think happened was that women's voices were important voices. And when we start as an oral tradition and you go to a written tradition and you want to sort of, keep the women involved, they are the ones who are going to be educating the children. You can't just dismiss it. So is that human nature? Were we ahead of the curve? I don't think that I want to get that Jewishly arrogant to say that we were ahead of the curve. Instead, I think that when we look for these things, we will find them. So Jonathan Kirsch, who has written a number of books, he writes about what he calls counter traditions. That when we start to look for the counter traditions in our tradition, they're there. But they run the risk of being overwhelmed and silenced by dominant male voices. And so I think that it's incumbent on us as humans, as humanistic Jews, for women, to be able to go back to the text, back to our tradition and say, not so fast. Wisdom in Proverbs. I was there when you created the world, which is not the counterpoint that we hear in Genesis 1 and 2, right? In the creation of the world, there's no mention, but that voice is still there. And if we read for it, we're going to find it. I'm not making this up. Chokhmah is there. It'd be one thing if I'm like, I'm going to rewrite the text. No, I'm not that arrogant either, right? We
And
take the text
someone had mentioned Ruth, and someone else also just asked about if you could talk a little bit more about Ruth. Someone mentioned Ruth as their favorite, and I certainly can see why. And the book of Ruth obviously is so powerful in its statement of people who join the Jewish community. Can you talk a little bit more about Ruth?
Sure. So Ruth is also one of my favorite characters in it, but mostly because the book of Ruth is a story of loyalty. It's a story of friendship. And it's one of the very few situations where I'm hoping my cat's not going to decide he wants to get in front of the screen. Sorry. Where it's one of the few situations where we have an example of female friendship. And we don't even have the kinds of pledges that Ruth actually makes to Naomi going all the way through today. When we think about in modern culture, there's the promise that that's made between Thelma and Louise in that same movie, right? There's somebody pointed out to me that there's a whole section of promises made in discussing the book of Ruth in the movie Fried Green Tomatoes. All right. I don't want to get too far afield. Nonetheless, when Ruth says to Naomi, wherever you go, I will go. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. It is stunning, two women on the road on their own, that Ruth is not going to let Naomi be by herself as she goes back from Moab to Bethlehem. Her other daughter-in-law, Orpah, she went back to where? Her mother's house, to the Beit Em. And so this friendship, and born of survival, it's intergenerational, I think is absolutely lovely. It is often used and understood to be a statement of conversion when it says your God will be my God. I view it as a statement of loyalty and commitment. Loyalty and commitment is what I take from Ruth.
And even when I was at my previous organization, which was focused on welcoming interfaith families, which in some cases does include choosing formally to become Jewish, that order of the statement, your people shall be my people and your God shall be my God, was so profound because it's people first and then God second. And that was, I don't think, done by mistake. But I will tell you that I years ago, I wrote this op-ed saying conversion basically in the other denominations was too high a barrier, and let's look at the way Ruth joined the Jewish people. And I got a call from an Orthodox rabbi who said I was misreading the text, and that of course Ruth had a mikvah, you know, a ritual bath, and of course Ruth had a Beit Din, a court of 3 rabbis. And I said to him, how did she have a Beit Din 1,000 years before there were any rabbis? And he gave the best answer, which was either you believe it all or you don't. And it shut me right the hell up, because to me, that was internally consistent with ultra-Orthodox viewpoint. What I couldn't take was the conservative Judaism or Reform Judaism answers about the high barriers, because it wasn't internally consistent. But from the Orthodox, I totally, like, you either believe it all or you don't. And like, there's no arguing with that. But so that obviously my piece was not written for that community, though. It was for the middle ground community. Miriam.
Right. And I was
Yes.
going to say, Miriam, just before
Yeah.
you say anything, so when I do a wedding ceremony, one of the options that I give couples, particularly in an interfaith setting, is the wrapping of a talit, which usually is a family heirloom. And I wrap them both in it, indicating that the fringes tie the generations together and that this tradition is now theirs together to make of it as they will going forward, because as it says in the book of Ruth, your people, wherever you go, I will go, your people are my people.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's
lovely.
a way of bringing that forward.
It's
Yeah.
so powerful. This is unfortunately we're getting toward the end, so Miriam will have the last question. Go ahead. Miriam.
Sure. It's not a question. It's a thank you, Jodi. And also it's a pitch about a book that Rabbi Shalom and I are in the process of editing that goes back through the holidays and takes the written material that we've produced in the past on the holidays. And Jodi, we did Shavuot this week. I just got off the phone with him before this. And so I read the Book of Ruth thing, and I've seen your Book of Ruth. I wanted to commend you that your presentation was fresh and new for me. And that's right after reading all the other stuff you've written about women in the Bible. But also to let people know that in the next 6 months or so, that this wonderful book that we're calling it Holidays Without the Holy will be available for us to kind of dig into how humanistic Jews have looked at holidays over the past 60 years.
Great.
Thank you,
Well,
Jodi.
Jodi, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I certainly can see how you could talk about it for another 2 hours. And but I'm going to be mindful of your time and everyone's time. Thank you all. We'll be back next month for another episode, and invite your friends who are members, or to have them become members so that they can join us. Thank you all. Have a great day. Take care. Thanks again, Jodi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.